A dying note, a final request, and a secret only Holmes could hear. Welcome to Silent Case Files. I am your host, Pendleton. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments bring these mysteries to life. Let's begin. It was on a storm-swept morning in March of 1893 when I was once again drawn into one of the most singular cases ever to cross the threshold of 221B Baker Street, a case involving a shattered window pane, a dying request, and a melody that would not die. The wind rattled the panes of our sitting room as I entered, carrying under one arm the British Medical Journal and under the other a parcel of Turkish delight, which Mrs. Hudson, having taken a recent interest in the Levant, had persuaded me to sample. I found Holmes precisely where I had expected him, stretched languidly upon the settee with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp gaze fixed not on any book or client, but on the ceiling itself, as though it might confess some vital truth if only stared at long enough. "You have made 2 stops," he murmured, without shifting so much as a toe, "and chose the Turkish delight over the almond nougat, though you wavered." I paused mid-step. "Holmes, honestly?" "Spare me your protest, Watson. The trace of powdered sugar on your right cuff is unmistakable, and the warmth of the parcel betrays its recent purchase. The smell of cardamom suggests Turkish delight rather than the more pedestrian nougat. As for the 2 stops, there's a faint smudge of coal soot on your left shoe, consistent with the grit near the kiosk by the rail station, and a paper crinkle I associate with the pharmacy register you invariably fold in 2. I sank into my chair. "One day, Holmes, you shall over-explain yourself and ruin your own legend." "Unlikely," he said with a tight smile. "But tell me, Watson, have you ever heard of a violinist by the name of Anton Garadelli?" I thought for a moment. "The Italian virtuoso, played under von Bülow in Berlin, if memory serves. One of the few left-handed violinists of note." "Why do you ask?" "Because Mr. Garadelli expired late last night under rather peculiar circumstances. Inspector Lestrade paid me a visit at dawn. He was hoping I might be roused by the matter of a shattered Stradivarius and a curious final request." I blinked. "A request?" Holmes nodded and leaned forward with sudden animation, as if the strings of his own mind had been plucked. "Yes, Watson. The maestro died in his Mayfair townhouse shortly before midnight. Cause of death appears natural, no signs of violence, forced entry, or poison. Yet before he died, he summoned his butler with what strength remained and asked only this: 'Send for Sherlock Holmes, tell him the 4th note was a lie.' Then he passed away." I leaned forward. "The 4th note?" Holmes stood and moved to the fireplace, striking a match with unnecessary drama. "Precisely. Lestrade believes the man was raving, but the mention of my name and the specificity of the message suggests something more, something deliberate. But if there was no foul play—" Holmes raised a slender finger. "Ah, Watson, but consider. Anton Garadelli was renowned not only for his musicianship, but for his obsession with symmetry and precision. His townhouse was discovered in perfect order, except for one item. His prized Stradivarius lay smashed upon the hearth, and next to it 4 handwritten bars of music, barely legible, marked Adagio molto, and in the 4th bar, an unplayable note." I stood. "You mean he wrote a musical cipher?" "Or a dying confession," Holmes replied. "Either way, I suspect it was no accident that he died mere hours before he was to premiere his Adagio for a Broken Republic, a composition he had locked away for nearly a decade." As Holmes reached for his coat, I followed suit. The air in the room had shifted. He was no longer lounging in contemplation, but moving with purpose. The game, as always, was afoot. "Where to?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. To Mayfair, Watson, to the scene of a death that sings louder in silence than it ever did in life. The cab ride to Mayfair was uneventful but brisk, the streets, slick from morning rain, blurred beneath the wheels as Holmes sat in silence, fingers drumming upon the ivory handle of his cane. He had brought with him only a small leather case, his kit for minute investigations, and his eyes remained half-lidded, as though he were attending a symphony only he could hear. I had long ago ceased trying to prompt him during such reveries. The music of his thoughts was better left uninterrupted. We arrived before a modest but elegant townhouse at the corner of Brook Street. Despite the musician's fame, Garadelli had eschewed excessive grandeur. The building's facade of clean Georgian lines and modest stonework gave little hint of the artistic genius or turmoil within. A constable stood at the door, and recognizing Holmes at once, ushered us in with the deference of one who had seen the man's work reduce more than one seemingly insoluble case to mere arithmetic. Inspector Lestrade waited in the front hall, hands behind his back, his face set in that familiar expression of professional impatience mingled with reluctant admiration. "Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us, nodding. "The body's been removed, of course. The doctor signed off on a probable heart attack. No bruising, no wound, no sign of struggle. But, well, I'd be lying if I said the man's last words haven't been troubling me." "They were meant to," Holmes replied. "Lead us to something he could not say aloud. You have the music?" Lestrade handed over a folded sheaf of manuscript paper, its topmost page smudged at the edges with what looked to be ash. Holmes opened it carefully, his eyes narrowing. "4 bars," he muttered, in the key of C minor, each phrase delicately constructed, except this. He pointed to the 4th bar where a single note had been scrawled just above the staff, circled in pencil. An E sharp, an enharmonic equivalent of F, of course, but not in this key, and certainly not in this context. It disrupts the harmony entirely. Lestrade frowned. He was dying. Maybe his hand slipped. Holmes smiled thinly. A composer like Garadelli would sooner die in silence than mar his work with error. "No, this was deliberate. May I see the room?" "Right this way." We ascended the staircase to the 2nd floor, where a heavy oak door opened into Garadelli's music studio. It was a room of rare character, bookshelves crammed with manuscripts and theory texts, a grand piano tucked beneath tall windows, and rows of violins hung upon the far wall like hunting trophies. One violin lay on the carpet near the fireplace, its pieces arranged like bones, neck and scroll snapped, strings flaccid, and the belly cracked wide open. Holmes bent to examine it. "His Stradivarius," he said softly. "He called it Lucia, after a woman he loved and lost. This would not have fallen. It was thrown." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. The butler heard a crash, came in, found the maestro collapsed on the divan, the violin broken, and the sheet music on the floor. "That's all we have." Holmes ignored him, his gaze sweeping the room with a dancer's grace. He moved to the writing desk, where a half-empty glass of cognac rested beside a smudged inkwell. With delicate fingers, he lifted a sheet of parchment and held it to the light. "No fresh ink, nothing here written recently. Watson, note the dust along the top edge of this bureau. It's been undisturbed except for one place where the layer is broken. Something rectangular once rested here, recently removed." I leaned closer. "A photograph? Possibly, or a box. Lestrade, do you know what Garadelli intended to perform this evening?" "Something he called his Adagio for a Broken Republic. Private performance at the Mercian Society of Arts. Invitation only." Holmes nodded. "A political title for a man who rarely spoke of politics. Was he of any particular persuasion?" Lestrade shook his head. "Never said a word to the papers, as far as I know." "I suspect the piece contains more than music," Holmes murmured. "Tell me, was anyone else in the house last night?" The butler says no. He had retired early. The maestro often worked late, alone. Holmes moved to the windows and studied the shattered pane nearest the hearth. Cracks radiating outward. This was broken from inside, not outside. The impact was forceful, perhaps with the violin itself, yet the rest of the room is untouched. There was no struggle, no defensive wounds. He smashed his own instrument. That is significant. He dropped to one knee near the baseboard beneath the broken window. "Watson, come."
"Here. Look at this." I joined him and followed his pointing finger to a tiny object half concealed in the carpet fibres. It was a splinter of dark wood, not from the violin. It was darker, rougher, almost like ebony. Holmes pocketed it with care. "Not from the Stradivarius," he confirmed, "but something else, perhaps a box." He stood again and paced back to the piano. Running his hand along the keys, he struck a slow minor chord. Then, ever so gently, he played the 4 bars from the sheet Lestrade had given him, his fingers hesitating deliberately over the 4th note. "The lie," he whispered. Yes, I believe I understand." "What do you mean?" I asked. Holmes turned to us. This was not a confession, it was a key. The 4th note was meant to draw attention to something he had hidden or destroyed. A warning, a message. We need to know who stood to benefit from his death. Lestrade nodded. "I can start inquiries. He had no family, estranged from his sister in Naples, I believe. But he had a patron, Lady Agnes Delamere. She funded his last 3 concerts." Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The Delameres? Interesting. She has political affiliations, pro-Burgundian sympathies, if I'm not mistaken, and Garadelli's composition, with its evocative title, may have ruffled the feathers of those invested in the opposite direction." "Are you suggesting," I said, "that the maestro was murdered over music?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Not over music, Watson, over what the music might have revealed." He moved to the fireplace once more and studied the charred embers. A single sheet of music survived, but what if there were others? What if Garadelli wrote a coded composition, something he feared would fall into the wrong hands? Lestrade looked unconvinced. Then why break the violin? To delay whoever came after him, or to draw attention to the message as a last act of defiance? He turned to the inspector. "I'll need to speak with the butler, and I shall want a full list of everyone who received invitations to tonight's performance. If Garadelli feared exposure, he may have embedded the truth where only the careful listener might hear it." Lestrade gave a tight nod and left the room. Holmes remained still for a moment, his eyes on the broken violin. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. "The 4th note was a lie, but the silence afterward may be louder than we know." I knew then, without needing to ask, that this case was far from simple. A composer's cryptic deathbed message, a shattered masterpiece, and a vanished clue. Holmes was already in pursuit of the harmony behind the chaos, and heaven help whoever stood in the way of his melody. The butler, Mr. Griggs, was a slight man of advanced years with a permanently furrowed brow and eyes that blinked as though the light of day were perpetually too harsh for him. We found him in the back parlour, seated stiffly on the edge of a faded armchair, his long fingers worrying a handkerchief into creases. At our entrance, he rose and bowed slightly. Holmes, never one to waste time, fixed him with that hawkish stare of his. "You were in service to Mr. Garadelli for how long?" 11 years, sir," the butler replied in a voice dry and faintly tremulous. "Since his arrival in London."
And last evening you heard a noise? Yes, sir. Some time after 11. I had gone to bed, as the maestro had not requested anything further. He often worked late. But I heard a crash, glass I assumed, and something like wood snapping. I hurried downstairs and found him collapsed in the chair by the fire. The violin, his throat worked. It was broken, pieces everywhere. He looked very pale. I tried to fetch water, but he stopped me. He said only, "Send for Sherlock Holmes. Tell him the fourth note was a lie." Then he passed. You're quite sure of the wording? Every syllable, sir. It shocked me, and I repeated it aloud to myself for fear of forgetting. Holmes gave a single nod, then turned to pace slowly about the room, his fingers interlaced behind his back. Had the maestro received any unusual visitors of late? Griggs hesitated. There was a gentleman 3 days ago. I did not get his name. He wore gloves and asked not to be announced. Said he and the maestro were old adversaries. I told Mr. Garadelli and he waved me off, said he would see him in the music room. How long did the meeting last? Barely 20 minutes. The gentleman left briskly. He did not speak to me. Holmes turned to me. Watson, you will recall the dust pattern on the bureau upstairs. Of course, something was removed recently. Holmes returned to Griggs. Did your master keep a box or case there? Perhaps lacquered wood, dark in colour? Griggs blinked rapidly. Yes, sir. A small chest, kept locked, I believe. Contained old letters, photographs, I'm not sure what else. But it was always in that spot. And is it missing now? Yes, I suppose it is. I hadn't noticed. Holmes nodded, as though a piece of the puzzle had aligned in his mind. Did the visitor leave anything behind, a card, a scent? Griggs blinked again. A scent, sir? Yes. Tobacco, cologne, anything noticeable? The butler paused. I recall something bitter, like burned cloves, perhaps. Faint. It clung to the hallway. Holmes turned away, seemingly satisfied, and we soon left the room, returning to the study. Lestrade had rejoined us with a slim folder under one arm. I've a list of guests for tonight's concert, he said. It includes diplomats, critics, and a few names from the theatre crowd. Rather eclectic gathering. Holmes took the list and scanned it. Ah, Lady Agnes Delamere, I see, and, Lord Havelock Villiers. That's unexpected. I looked up. You know him? A figure.
In foreign affairs, discreet dealings with Eastern Europe, not the sort of man to attend a private recital for pleasure, unless... He trailed off, eyes distant. Lestrade interjected, We've questioned the staff thoroughly. No sign of forced entry. If the box is gone, it was either taken by this mystery visitor 3 days ago or someone with access after Garadelli's death. Holmes nodded absently. There is something theatrical about the whole affair. A final message, a deliberate destruction, a public performance on the horizon. Garadelli was orchestrating something, and someone meant to silence him before the coda could be played. He turned and strode once more to the ruined violin. It is not simply a broken instrument. It is a symbol, perhaps even a warning. We must understand what the music contained. What do you propose? I asked. Holmes straightened. We must reconstruct the missing composition. If Garadelli was murdered for what he wrote, then the key lies in his final bars. Lestrade, I will need access to the Society of Arts, their archives, and any copies of Garadelli's compositions they possess. He may have shared drafts. Lestrade scratched his head. I can arrange that. Also, Holmes added, we must visit Lady Agnes. If she funded his performances, she may know what drove him to such secrecy. Within the hour, we arrived at the Delamere residence in Belgravia. The townhouse was a monument to taste and restraint, neither ostentatious nor threadbare, with a peculiar scent of lavender and ink that hung faintly in the air. Lady Agnes herself received us in a sitting room with pale green walls and an impressive display of lithographs. She was tall, elegant, and possessed of that unwavering gaze one associates with experienced gamblers and seasoned diplomats. "Mr. Holmes," she said coolly, offering a hand, "I feared you might call. News travels quickly when music dies violently." Holmes bowed. "And when it dies mid-sentence, Lady Delamere, some of us strain to hear what was meant to follow." She regarded him for a moment, then gestured for us to sit. "I assume you believe his death was not natural?" "I assume nothing, but I find composers do not destroy their instruments without cause." She smiled faintly. Anton was dramatic, but yes, he was frightened. For weeks he had been reclusive, easily startled. He cancelled engagements, burned old manuscripts. I suspected he was being blackmailed. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Did he say so?" "Not directly, but he once asked me if the society would accept a posthumous performance. I thought it morbid at the time." "Did he ever mention a composition titled Adagio for a Broken Republic?" Her eyes sharpened. "Yes, it was meant to be his masterpiece. He said it was the truth in sound. I thought he was speaking metaphorically." "Did he confide its meaning?" "No, but he hinted it was based on letters, correspondence from his youth, something political. He fled Italy under a shadow, you know." "I do," Holmes murmured. "And the man who visited him 3 days ago?" She stiffened slightly. Tall, gloved, accent I couldn't place, spoke to Anton privately. I saw them briefly when I dropped by to discuss the program. Anton looked pale afterward, refused to speak of it. "Would you recognize the man?" "I might." Holmes stood. "You may be called upon to do so. Thank you for your candour, Lady Delamere." As we departed, I turned to Holmes. "You think this man stole the box?" "Possibly. Or frightened Garadelli into destroying part of the composition." "And Villiers?" "I shall make inquiries. But my instinct tells me this case leads beyond Garadelli's death. It leads to what he tried to reveal." We returned to Baker Street late that afternoon. Holmes, once inside, moved at once to his desk and began transposing the 4-bar manuscript to a new staff, analyzing the rhythm, key changes, and structure. I watched as he scribbled and muttered, referencing volumes from his bookshelf, cryptographic patterns in classical music, the ciphers of Rossini, Ravel, and hidden political sentiment. Then he froze. "Watson," he said quietly, "look here." He pointed to the 4th bar, the so-called lie. "This E sharp, it creates a tritone with the bass note, a forbidden interval. It would be jarring to the ear, discordant, unnatural, but viewed as a code." He scribbled furiously, then stepped back. "I believe," he said, "that Garadelli embedded a sequence, a message in musical intervals. If I am correct, the entire piece, if reconstructed, might read like a confession or revelation. And someone did not wish that revelation to be heard." He tapped the page. "We are not merely chasing a murderer, Watson. We are chasing a truth someone killed to silence, and I intend to hear it played in full." The room fell into silence, save for the scratch of his pen as he began decoding music not meant for ears, but for the mind. The following morning dawned grey and damp, the kind of weather that pressed against the windows of Baker Street like an unwanted visitor. I awoke to find Holmes already up, a rare occasion, seated cross-legged in the armchair with his violin resting on his knee, not in performance but in contemplation. The fragments of Garadelli's melody were pinned in front of him on the mantel, the 4th bar enlarged and marked in pencil. He was playing no tune, only bowing single notes, pausing after each, listening intently as if waiting for them to speak. "You're not composing a requiem, I hope," I said, as I poured myself a cup of tea. Holmes did not look up. I'm trying to understand a man's death by understanding what he lived for. There is meaning here, Watson. This is no ordinary discord. He lowered the violin and gestured to the sheaf of paper. I have
transcribed Garadelli's intervals into letter sequences. He employed a variation of the Guidonian cipher, ancient but adaptable. In this case, each interval corresponds to a Latin character. The message is incomplete, of course, but I have 6 legible letters. I leaned closer and squinted. Caesars. Possibly Caesar's, Holmes confirmed, or the beginning of Caesarea, or some name. There is more hidden in the unwritten measures, if only we had them. A knock at the door spared me from further guessing. It was Inspector Lestrade, looking both impatient and faintly flustered. "We've found the box," he announced. Holmes rose like a cat sprung from its rest. "Where?" "Pawn shop in Clerkenwell. A man matching the butler's description brought it in. Griggs himself." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Impossible?" "Griggs may be evasive, but he's not duplicitous. Nevertheless, the shopkeeper identified him positively. We've detained him." Holmes turned away, eyes narrowing as he processed this revelation. "No. Too convenient. The box is recovered, the butler accused, and everyone breathes easy. No, it doesn't fit. Unless—" He snatched up his coat. "Watson, come. We must see this box." At the station, Griggs sat pale and stunned in the holding cell, his eyes sunken with fatigue. The supposed box lay on a table in the adjacent room, carefully unwrapped by Lestrade. It was a polished ebony container, plain in design, but clearly old. The clasp had been broken and its contents removed. "No papers inside," Lestrade said. "Only this." He held up a single playing card, the King of Spades, its back hand-painted with a sigil resembling an eagle perched on a pillar. Holmes took it with reverence, turning it between his fingers. "Not from any English deck," he murmured. "Watson, look here, this motif. It's the crest of the House of Savoy." "The Italian royal family," I said. "Precisely. This is no gambling card, it's a mark of allegiance, or perhaps a threat." He turned to Griggs, who had been brought in. "You did not pawn the box, Mr. Griggs? Of that I am certain." Griggs shook his head, trembling. "No, sir, I would never. I found it gone, sir. The morning after his death. I said nothing because I feared I'd be blamed." Holmes studied him. "And you saw no one enter?" "No, sir." Holmes gave Lestrade a sharp look. "The pawn slip." Lestrade produced it. Holmes scanned it, then passed it to me. "The name signed is Edward G. Rowntree. A falsehood. Look at the script. The R has a Ligurian curl. It's Italian. Our mystery guest, I suspect." Holmes turned to Griggs. "You are free to go for now, but I advise you to remain in London." As the butler was led away, Holmes pocketed the playing card and turned toward the door. "Where now?" I asked, as we emerged into the misty street. "To the Society of Arts. If Garadelli submitted even a fragment of his adagio, it will be there, and I believe the key to his death lies within its unfinished melody." The Society's headquarters stood in Fitzrovia, an imposing Georgian structure with tall windows and a dome that seemed too grand for its modest purpose. We were ushered into a music library by a rotund archivist named Mr. Penfield, who wore spectacles so thick they magnified his eyes to the point of absurdity. "We received a partial manuscript from Maestro Garadelli 3 weeks ago," he said, bustling to a drawer. "He said he would bring the final movement closer to the performance date. Sadly, that never happened." He handed over a sheaf of staves, each inscribed in Garadelli's hand. Holmes read them swiftly, then whistled low. "What is it?" I asked. "See here, this melody line. Holmes said, tapping the page. It repeats a particular motif in odd intervals, a rising fourth, then a minor sixth, followed by a descending fifth. This is not musical symmetry, it is alphabetical encoding. He pulled the previous manuscript from his coat and laid them side by side. It's the same cipher, he confirmed, but this section contains more notes, enough perhaps to complete the phrase. He jotted down translations as he spoke, converting intervals to letters. Slowly, a message began to emerge, character by character. Caesars fall when... He paused, eyes narrowing. The rest is lost, but I dare say we are not dealing with a simple confession. Ghirardelli composed a warning. I stared. A political statement? Perhaps. Or a revelation. Imagine, a performance broadcast to London's elite, revealing a coded message embedded in the composition, a warning about treachery or subversion. It would be dramatic, poetic, dangerous. We returned to Baker Street in a state of grim contemplation. Holmes withdrew to his violin, playing the uncovered motif in different arrangements, testing the rhythm and accent. By late afternoon, the message had formed more fully. Caesars fall when loyalty bows to gold. Holmes played the notes once more. It's a warning and an accusation. Someone believed Ghirardelli meant to expose them, and they silenced him. But who? I asked. And why now? Just then, a note was slipped under our door. Holmes retrieved it and read it aloud. You have tuned your ear too finely, Mr. Holmes. There is no harmony in truth. Only noise. Let the concert die. A friend of silence. I started to speak, but Holmes had already snatched up his coat. They will cancel the performance if they grow fearful. We must move quickly. Someone in that room tomorrow was meant to hear Ghirardelli's secret, and someone else intends to make sure they never do. He tapped the card from the box against the mantel. And I believe this King of Spades is the last performer left on Ghirardelli's stage. He turned toward me. We go to the concert hall, Watson. For in a world where lies are sung, the truth must be performed before it is buried in silence forever. The Mercian Society of Art stood at the eastern edge of Grosvenor Square, its pale stone facade weathered but noble, its arched windows facing the street like dignified eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. It was early evening when Holmes and I arrived, a light rain dappling the pavement and lending a hushed quality to the city's bustle. From within, we could hear the faint strains of a cello being tuned, a mournful resonance that seemed all too appropriate. A steward in white gloves admitted us through a side entrance after Holmes presented a sealed letter from Inspector Lestrade granting temporary investigative access. The performance, we learned, was still scheduled for the following night, though Ghirardelli's death had caused no small consternation among the board of directors. The chairwoman had insisted the show must go on, if only to honor the maestro's legacy. The main auditorium was empty when we entered, save for two musicians testing the acoustics with soft scales. Holmes stood at the threshold for a long moment, observing the sweep of the vaulted ceiling and the arched proscenium. Then, without a word, he began to walk the perimeter, his footfalls silent on the plush red carpet. I followed as he made his way to the stage and gestured toward the conductor's stand. There, resting atop the music shelf, was the score for Adagio for a Broken Republic, printed in Ghirardelli's own hand. Holmes examined the manuscript closely, his fingers gliding across the staves without touching the ink. "Not the original," he murmured. "A facsimile, yet remarkably detailed. Note the careful phrasing, the emphasis marks in the second movement, and, this." He pointed to a single notation in the lower margin of the third page, It was a tiny inked symbol, one that might have passed unnoticed by even a discerning eye, a diagonal slash through the letter G, stylized like a sword. "I've seen this before," Holmes said. "It is the insignia of the Circolo Nero." "The what?" I asked. "A clandestine Italian society, half political, half criminal. Operates under the pretext of defending national purity, but in truth they specialize in blackmail and ideological manipulation. They are known to eliminate those whose artistic or political expression challenges their doctrine. Garadelli must have known he was being watched." "You think he was a target?" "I think he was a liability," Holmes said grimly. "And a composer with secrets is more dangerous than any diplomat, for he speaks in languages beyond words." He turned from the score and moved backstage, where a row of dressing rooms lined a dim corridor. One door bore a brass plate that read Maestro. Holmes tried the handle. It was unlocked. The dressing room was small, austere, and smelled faintly of lemon oil and pipe tobacco. A narrow table supported a vase of dried flowers and a cracked mirror. Holmes moved to the desk, rifling through its drawers with a swiftness that betrayed practice. Most were empty. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of programs, he discovered a torn envelope addressed in Garadelli's hand, but the name had been scrawled out and the contents removed. Holmes held it to the light. "See the indentation?" he asked, angling it so I could see the faint outlines of writing pressed into the paper. "It was once a letter, perhaps to Lady Delamere or someone else." He pulled a graphite stick from his pocket and gently shaded over the paper, coaxing the indentations into visibility. The words emerged, uneven but readable. "You were right to fear the fourth note. They watch. The performance must go on. The truth must sound even if I do not live to hear it." We stared at the words for a long moment. "The fourth note," I said softly. "He meant the coded bar. He was planning this all along." Holmes nodded. "And now someone else will try to stop it." Footsteps echoed in the corridor. A moment later, a tall man in formal concert black stepped into the doorway. He was in his late 50s, lean and hawk-nosed, with grey hair brushed straight back and a heavy gold ring on one hand. His eyes, pale and appraising, locked on Holmes at once. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, in a crisp baritone. "This room is sealed until tomorrow's program." Holmes offered a genial smile. "Mr. Armand de Joria, I presume? Concertmaster for the Society?" "I am, and you are trespassing." "Sherlock Holmes, I believe you knew Maestro Garadelli." De Joria's expression flickered. "I knew him as one knows any artist, professionally. We performed together, nothing more." "You visited him 4 days ago." "I did not." Holmes stepped closer. Tall, gloved, smelled faintly of clove and smoke, described yourself as an old adversary. De Joria's hand clenched, then released. "I will not be questioned without a warrant." "You won't be questioned at all if you prefer," Holmes said lightly. "But I'll make a note that you denied contact with the deceased, even though you were seen by his butler and Lady Delamere." There was a pause. Then De Joria said, very quietly, "I told him not to perform it." "Why?" "Because it was suicide. He'd buried secrets in that music. You must understand. There are people who listen." Holmes gave a slight nod. "And people who kill." De Joria's mouth tightened. "I did not harm him. I swear that. I came to warn him, to urge him to destroy the manuscript." "Did he?" "He said he'd altered it, hid the truth in the harmony, but I don't know how. And now I don't think anyone does." Holmes studied him. "One more question. Do you recognize this?" He produced the King of Spades from his coat. De Joria's face paled. He took a step back. "Where did you Get that? In the box stolen from Garadelli after his death, DeGioia exhaled sharply. Then it's true, he was marked. Marked? That card, DeGioia said, was sent to members of the Circolo Nero as a call to silence. It means a performance must never be completed. It means the music is a weapon. Holmes's voice was cold. And now that weapon remains on the society's stage, ready to be heard. DeGioia looked haunted. Then you must stop the concert. But Holmes only shook his head. No, Mr. DeGioia, I mean to attend it. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes was more withdrawn than usual. He sat with his violin untouched beside him, his gaze fixed on the score, now pinned to the far wall. They will try again, I said. You know they will. Yes, Holmes replied. And this time the attempt may not be subtle. Then why let the concert go forward? Holmes turned his sharp eyes to me. Because if Garadelli's truth dies with him, they win, and I refuse to let silence be the victor. I said nothing more. The shadows lengthened, and the streets outside darkened into a deeper fog. Tomorrow the concert would begin, and someone, perhaps several, would do anything to ensure it never ended. The next day arrived with the heavy silence that often precedes an unfolding storm. A pale sun hovered behind gauzy clouds, casting an eerie grey pallor over Baker Street as Holmes paced the sitting room like a panther in a cage. I had rarely seen him so restless. His usual cool detachment had given way to a simmering urgency, barely held in check by the methodical clench of his jaw and the taut rhythm of his steps. He paused only once that morning to sketch something in the margin of Garadelli's facsimile score, and then return it to the envelope marked for Inspector Lestrade. Insurance, he muttered, sealing it. Should anything happen to me tonight, see that it reaches him unopened. I did not like that tone, not in Holmes. By 5 o'clock we had dressed for the evening's performance. Holmes wore a dark, double-breasted evening coat and a grey cravat, fastened not with a pin but with a small brass stud. Unusual, but I knew better than to question such choices. Holmes's affectations were rarely without utility. I, meanwhile, dressed in formal black, our seats reserved discreetly in the third row of the central aisle under assumed names arranged by Lestrade. The inspector himself would be stationed near the wings, dressed as a theatre porter. The Mercian Society of Arts was ablaze with gaslight when we arrived. Carriages lined the square like beetles in rows, and a red carpet stretched out along the steps, flanked by footmen and stewards. Inside, the main hall swelled with the perfume of civility, fine coats, diamond brooches, murmured gossip, and the shuffling of playbills. The audience was a sea of polished anticipation, unaware that the performance they awaited had once been intended as a political confession and might yet become a public spectacle of another kind. Lady Agnes Delamere sat 2 rows ahead of us, wearing black velvet and no jewellery. She turned as we entered, offering Holmes a single, grave nod. Holmes returned it with a flicker of acknowledgment. The curtain rose promptly at 6:30. Armand DeGioia strode out to polite applause, bowed, and took his place. The orchestra lifted their instruments. The first movement began softly, a mournful progression in C minor, rich in harmonic dissonance. Garadelli's signature style was unmistakable, lush, brooding, but shot through with undercurrents of urgency. Holmes sat rigid beside me, his eyes closed, head tilted slightly as though following invisible threads between each note. I saw his left hand tapping in quiet rhythm, counting something, intervals perhaps. Code. Midway through the second movement, Holmes opened his eyes and leaned slightly toward me. He altered it, he whispered. The harmonic structure is consistent with the cipher. The message, I murmured. Still there, hidden but distorted, some tones modulated, some inverted. He rewrote it to ensure it could not be easily erased. The fourth note is embedded throughout. The piece swelled. From the violins came a trembling motif, threading upward in a curious pattern, dissonant, abrupt. Holmes stiffened. Then it happened. A loud crack resounded from the rear of the stage, sharp, sudden, unmistakable. Gasps erupted. The violins faltered. DeGioia turned sharply, baton frozen mid-air. From behind the proscenium, a figure emerged, dressed in stagehand black, face partially covered with a white cloth. In his hands, a pistol, unmistakable and glinting beneath the footlights. Screams broke the spell. Panic spread like fire. Holmes was already on his feet. "Stay here, Watson," he snapped. He moved like lightning, cutting through the aisle, leaping over the front barrier, and vanishing behind the curtain. I rose to follow, but was nearly bowled over by a wave of terrified patrons pushing toward the exits. In the chaos, I caught sight of Lady Delamere ushering two elderly guests toward the side hall with impressive calm, her face set and pale. It took me several desperate minutes to reach the wings. Lestrade was already there, shouting orders, revolver drawn. A cellist had fainted. Two stewards were attempting to herd the musicians off the stage. Holmes was nowhere in sight. A burst of movement near the rear loading dock caught my attention. I gave chase, heart pounding, and emerged into the alley behind the hall, in time to see Holmes grappling with the masked man near a stack of wooden crates. The gun had been knocked aside and now lay in the mud. The man, taller and stronger, threw Holmes backward, sending him crashing against the wall. But Holmes rolled, recovered, and swept the man's legs out from under him in one swift motion. He was on top of him in seconds,
wrenching the mask free. It was not DeGioia. It was a younger man, perhaps in his 30s, with an angular jaw and a faint scar beneath one eye. He was sweating, panting, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Who sent you?" Holmes demanded. The man said nothing. Holmes pulled the brass stud from his cravat and pressed it against the man's wrist. The man screamed. Lestrade arrived at that moment with two constables who hauled the attacker upright and dragged him away. Holmes straightened, brushing mud from his coat. "Electrified stud," he muttered, "handy for interrogations." "You risked your life," I said, my voice still hoarse from the sprint. "Garadelli risked his soul," Holmes replied. "I merely did my part." Inside, the audience had been evacuated. DeGioia was seated, breathing heavily, his baton snapped in two. Lady Delamere was speaking in low tones to one of the society's directors. Lestrade returned with the man's name, Marco Bellanti, an Italian national with known connections to radical underground circles. "Sent by the Circolo Nero," Holmes confirmed. His instructions were simple: interrupt the concert, ensure the adagio is never performed in full. If necessary, destroy the original score. "But the performance was a copy," I said. "Bellanti didn't know that," Holmes replied. "He likely assumed Garadelli had left the original with the society. He came prepared to silence anyone who stood in his way." Lestrade looked grim. "I'll make sure this reaches the Foreign Office. We may be dealing with a broader conspiracy." Holmes nodded. "You may also wish to discreetly search Armand DeGioia's flat. Though he denied involvement, I suspect he had advance warning of the attack." "You think he's part of it?" "No," Holmes said, "but he feared it. And when people are afraid, they lie to feel safe." Later that night, back at Baker Street, we sat once again before the hearth, the tension draining slowly from our bones. "Garadelli died trying to deliver a truth few were prepared to hear," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "And yet, in a way, he succeeded. His adagio was played. His message, fragmented though it was, lives on in the music. That is the artist's greatest revenge." He stood and reached for his violin. Then, without another word, he began to play. Not Garadelli's adagio, but a new arrangement. One I did not recognize. Slow, searching, resolute. A tribute, perhaps. Or a lament, or, knowing Holmes, both. The following morning brought an uncanny stillness to London, a silence not of peace, but of consequence, as though the city itself had drawn breath but forgotten to release it. At Baker Street, Holmes sat with his back to the morning light, his long fingers laced beneath his chin, his eyes shut in thought. He had not spoken since finishing his violin tribute the previous night, save to instruct Mrs. Hudson that we would not receive callers
until noon. I said nothing, respecting the silence. In our long years together, I had seen Holmes in many moods: righteous fury, calculated coldness, mocking delight. But this brooding quiet was the rarest of all. It meant the final pattern of the case was nearly complete in his mind, though he had not yet decided whether to act or to observe. The breakfast untouched, the hearth unlit, and the city's newspapers unopened on the side table, these were omens all. It was nearly 10 when a soft knock at the door announced Lady Agnes Delamere. Holmes opened his eyes at once. Mrs. Hudson ushered her in with unusual deference. She wore the same black velvet as the night before, but now paired with a netted hat and gloves. She looked pale, but composed. "I won't take your time, Mr. Holmes," she said, removing her gloves. "But I believe you ought to see this." She drew from her satchel a small folded letter, its parchment brittle with age and the ink faded to a dusty brown. Holmes took it reverently. "It was among Garadelli's effects," she said. "I found it tucked inside the spine of one of his old theory notebooks. He must have hidden it years ago. I hesitated to bring it, fearing it might stain his legacy. But after last night, I believe the truth must come to light." Holmes read silently. I could see his eyes scanning the lines, flicking back once, then again. When he finally looked up, he passed it to me. It was written in Italian, but Holmes had already penciled a quick translation in the margin. It read, "To whomever finds this, I was 20 when I agreed to compose for the ministry." I believed I was writing patriotic music, nothing more, but they used my scores as signals, timed with acts of repression. One called for arrests, another for disappearances. My music led men to prison. I was a weapon, unwitting at first, then ashamed. I fled, changed my name, built a life in exile. But the guilt remained, so I composed my confession, an adagio for a broken republic, not to absolve myself, but to leave the truth in sound, uncorrupted by words. If you find this letter, then I am dead. Let the music live, even if I could not. A.G. There was a long pause. Holmes finally spoke. He was right to hide it. The Italian regime would have destroyed him had it been discovered. And yet, even in exile, they watched him. The Circolo Nero acted as a shadow branch of those in power, silencing dissidents, even abroad. Lady Delamere's voice was quiet. He told me once that he didn't fear death, only silence. Now I understand what he meant. Holmes stood and stepped toward the window, holding the letter to the grey light. Last night's attacker was merely the final act in a long overture, he murmured. The King of Spades was a symbol, execution by silence. But Garadelli outwitted them. He transformed the very tool they used against him, his music, into a message they could not erase. Lady Delamere placed a small parcel on the table. "This was delivered to me by post this morning. No return address. It's addressed to A.D. for safekeeping." Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound folio secured with twine. He untied it with almost ceremonial care. The title page read, "Adagio for a Broken Republic, Final Draft." to be played when the world is ready to listen. The pages that followed were music, but more than that. Holmes turned them slowly, nodding. "This version is different," he said. "The harmonies have changed again. The cipher remains, but it's masked deeper, transformed across tonal modes." He knew they'd try to stop him, so he created multiple versions. Each a mirror of the truth, distorted differently, like reflections in a cracked glass. Lady Delamere rose. "What will you do with it?" Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, "I shall deposit it with the British Library under an alias. Let scholars study it in 20 years. Let the public discover its meaning without the stain of current politics. If it were released now, it would spark not thought, but scandal." She nodded slowly. That would have pleased him. She turned to go, but Holmes stopped her. "One last question, Lady Delamere. Did Garadelli ever speak of the name Caesar's?" She paused. "Only once. He said it was a name used by those who served unquestioningly, who did as they were told without understanding the cost. He said, 'Caesars fall when loyalty bows to gold.'" Holmes nodded. "Thank you." After she had gone, he returned to the fire and sat, folding his long legs beneath him. "I now understand everything," he said softly. "Garadelli's early works were not mere national compositions. They were codes for terror. He learned this too late. He fled, tried to forget. But his guilt grew louder with time, and so in the end he composed not for fame, nor fortune, nor forgiveness, but for justice. And they killed him for it." "No," Holmes said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "They tried, but he won. His truth escaped them." I looked down at the folio resting on the table. Will the world ever understand? Holmes stood and poured himself a glass of brandy. "The world rarely understands anything until it's too late, Watson. But the important thing is this. The truth was not buried, it was played. And even if most of the audience missed the meaning, some will remember, some will wonder. And that is how revolutions begin, not with a bang, but with a melody that refuses to be forgotten." He raised the glass. "To Garadelli," he said. "To truth," I added. We drank. Outside, the fog began to lift from the rooftops, and for the first time in days, the sun touched the edge of Baker Street. Somewhere, perhaps, a violin was being tuned. It was 2 days later, under the delicate chill of a London morning, when the final ripple of the Garadelli affair reached our doorstep. The fog had lifted somewhat, both from the air and from the mystery, but the city itself remained subdued, as though uncertain whether to move on or to keep glancing backward at a performance that had very nearly ended in blood. Holmes, uncharacteristically, had remained indoors the entire time. He had taken to sitting at the desk by the front window with a small pot of ink and several sheets of manuscript paper, transcribing not notes, but intervals, shifts in pitch that corresponded to the cipher Garadelli had so carefully woven into his music. He was, as he explained to me once, trying to understand the mind that composed a confession only sound could bear. I had just returned from a meeting with Inspector Lestrade, who was wrapping up the final threads of the case. Marco Bellanti remained in custody, though the Foreign Office had grown oddly quiet about his extradition, suggesting pressures from across the Channel. Armand de Joria had resigned from the Mercian Society in disgrace, citing health concerns. And the Circolo Nero, though not formally implicated, had once again retreated into the shadows, like smoke into a flue. I placed my gloves on the sideboard and cleared my throat. Holmes glanced up without lifting his pen. "Lestrade sends his regards," I said. "The Foreign Office has decided to lose the extradition paperwork for Bellanti for the time being. They're afraid of what might come to light in court." Holmes snorted softly. Typical. Justice, so long as it's convenient. I crossed to the hearth, warming my hands. There's more. Lady Agnes has donated Garadelli's final draft to the Royal College of Music anonymously. It will be archived under the pseudonym The Broken Republic Suite, with a scholarly note that it is a reconstruction of suppressed political themes in early modern composition. Rather tactful. Holmes allowed a flicker of approval. Then at least the music lives, even if its truth remains veiled for now. I looked at him closely. You're not satisfied. I am content, he said slowly, but not finished. Finished with what? Understanding, he replied. There is a difference, Watson, between solving a case and comprehending it. We know how Garadelli died, we know why, but the man himself, the guilt he carried, the choices he made, those remain unfinished. He rose then, startling me slightly, and moved to the side table, where he opened a slim wooden case. From it he withdrew a folded letter, one we had not seen before. He handed it to me. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Garadelli's. Where did you get this? I asked, frowning. It arrived this morning, no return address, delivered by hand, according to Mrs. Hudson. The letter read, Mr. Holmes, if you are reading this, I am gone. I leave you no puzzle, no clever game. Only this, I was once a weapon, and I tried to become a voice, but I failed to finish. The piece as I had dreamed it. The final bars, the ones I wrote in darkness, I never heard played. Not even once. If you wish to understand me, then complete the melody. Let it be heard by ears not trained to decode, but to feel. That will be enough. Anton. I read it twice, then once more. Holmes was already at his violin case, lifting the instrument as reverently as a priest lifts a chalice. He set it beneath his chin and tightened the bow. I have reconstructed what I believe Garadelli intended, he said. Using the intervals from his cipher, the motifs repeated throughout the drafts and the silent spacing in the margins. It will not be precise, but it will be close. I sat down without a word. Holmes began to play. The first notes were hesitant, not from any lack of confidence, but because the music itself was searching. It unfolded like a memory rediscovered, fragile, uncertain, intimate. Then, slowly, it began to take shape. The theme from the original adagio emerged, but altered, less anguished, more resolved. The fourth note returned, no longer dissonant, but absorbed into the harmony, a lie transformed into truth. As he played, I felt the story rather than followed it. A young composer filled with ideals, the betrayal of his art, the bitter years of exile, the weight of guilt, and finally, the act of transfiguration, turning confession into creation. The final bars were soft as breath, then silence. Holmes lowered the violin. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, I said, "That was not Garadelli's guilt, that was his redemption." Holmes looked down at the instrument. Perhaps. Or perhaps it was his surrender. The clock ticked softly. After a while, he placed the violin back in its case and turned to the window where the sun had begun its slow descent over Baker Street. He gave us more than a mystery, he said. He gave us the burden of memory. And for once, I had no retort. I simply watched as the light shifted across the floorboards and the last echoes of the adagio faded into the silence where music once lived. It was not a case with medals or headlines. There would be no gallant reports in the Times, no knighthood from the Queen. But to Holmes, I suspect, it mattered more than any triumph before it. For once, the truth had not been spoken. It had been heard. It was a peculiar thing, in the weeks that followed, how the world seemed determined to forget what had happened. The concert at the Merchant Society was mentioned only in passing in the Times, and the name Anton Garadelli soon vanished from the city's conversation as though he had never existed. London, ever hungry for the next scandal or society diversion, turned its gaze to a royal christening, then a diplomatic spat in Constantinople, and then the weather, which was, by all accounts, unseasonably warm. But in our rooms at 221B Baker Street, the silence left behind by the maestro's final melody lingered like a perfume that could not be washed away. Holmes said little, as was often the case after a case that struck deeper than most. He resumed his routine, early morning tobacco ash analysis, chemical experiments of varying odour, and the occasional visit from a desperate client. But I could see in the tightness of his shoulders and the long hours spent at the violin that the Garadelli affair had pierced something even his formidable mind could not quite fence off. One rainy afternoon, nearly 3 weeks since the attempted assassination at the concert, Holmes received an envelope bearing a red wax seal and no return address. He sliced it open with the same casual efficiency he might apply to a telegram about a missing spaniel, until he read the signature. "It appears we have a visitor on the way, Watson," he said, tapping the note thoughtfully. "An old acquaintance from Florence, one Signor Paolo Vincetti. The name means nothing to me." "He's not the sort one forgets," Holmes said dryly. "Former diplomat, current patron of the arts, and, I believe, a financier of the Circolo Nero." That was enough to make me sit straighter. "He's coming here?" Holmes nodded. "He requests an audience to clarify the misinterpretation surrounding the late Maestro Garadelli. Brazen or theatrical, I suspect he wishes to offer a threat disguised as a courtesy." "You're going to receive him?" "I most certainly am." When Signor Vincetti arrived, it was with all the elegance and venom of a man who had once dined with kings and ordered deaths in the same breath. He was in his late 50s, well preserved, with a fine moustache and skin like polished walnut. His eyes, deep-set and unblinking, reminded me of a python's, beautiful in colour, but wholly without warmth. He removed his gloves delicately and offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor?" We inclined our heads. Holmes gestured to the chair by the fire, but Vincetti remained standing. "I come," he began, "not to revisit old wounds, but to preserve peace. The events at the Mercian Society were regrettable. A man acted impulsively. We regret the disruption." Holmes leaned back, expression unreadable. "And the murder of Anton Garadelli, was that regrettable too?" Vincetti smiled faintly. "A man dies, a melody lingers, but sometimes, Mr. Holmes, certain compositions must remain unfinished for the stability of nations, not egos." "That's a poetic way of describing political murder." "We believe in history, in order, in silence, when necessary. The maestro complicated our efforts by composing music, by embedding betrayal in it." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Signor, why is it that those who claim to serve order are always the first to burn what they cannot control?" Vincetti's expression hardened slightly. "You think you've won something, that the performance went
Ahead? That people listened? They did listen. No, Vincetti said coldly. They heard. They did not listen. The cipher you protect is meaningless without context. Without the full composition, without the testimony of its maker, it becomes another obscure suite in a minor key, a curiosity for academics." Holmes said nothing. "And so," Vincetti continued, "we will allow this music to exist. Let it be archived, studied, even played. Its sting is gone, the composer is gone, and the truth he sought to weaponize has already been buried under 1,000 louder lies." There was silence. Then Holmes said very quietly, "You are mistaken." Vincetti arched an eyebrow. "Garadelli's truth was never about exposure," Holmes went on. "It was not a bomb to be detonated. It was a seed, signor. One carefully planted, not meant to explode, but to grow, slowly, unnoticed at first, but inevitable." Vincetti's smile returned, though thinner now. "Then we shall see what grows." He replaced his gloves. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness is not immortality." "Perhaps not," Holmes said, rising. "But memory is, and you'd do well to remember that seeds flourish best in soil. Others believe barren." Vincetti paused at the door, then gave the faintest bow of his head. When he was gone, I exhaled slowly. "He admitted it," I said, "in everything but name." "Of course," Holmes murmured. "But men like Vincetti never fear the sword. They fear the mirror. And Garadelli was a mirror, one they could not bear to look into." He turned to the fire and stood there a long time. Later that evening, after supper, I found Holmes seated at his desk, the folio of Garadelli's final score open before him. He had penned annotations in the margins, not of musical theory, but philosophical questions. Can guilt be transcribed? What is confession if only the penitent understands it? If a truth is played but no one believes it, does it still ring true? He looked up as I entered. "I'm thinking of publishing an article," he said. "In the Musical Chronicle?" "No, in the Fortnightly Review. Less about music, more about the idea of encoded expression, about how meaning evolves when forced into silence." "You'll publish under your name?" "Certainly not. That would ruin the fun." We shared a quiet smile. Outside, the rain returned, tapping gently at the window panes. I could not help but think of Garadelli, of the young man who had written state-sponsored scores in ignorance, who had fled across borders not only to escape punishment, but to preserve something of his soul, and who, in the final measure of his life, composed not for legacy, but for truth. In the months to come, Adagio for a Broken Republic would be performed once more, quietly in a student recital at the Royal College, with no mention of its political underpinnings. A footnote, perhaps. A curiosity. But someone
would hear it, and someone would ask what it meant, and so the seed would grow. I turned to Holmes, who had resumed marking intervals on the page, lost once again in that private concert within his mind. And I thought, perhaps the greatest victories are not shouted in the streets, but whispered in parlours, played softly beneath the noise of history, and carried forward not by armies, but by melodies that refused to die. The maestro was gone, but his music had survived, and in that he had already won. It was early spring when the final echo of the Garadelli affair settled into memory, and London, in its ever-practical rhythm, turned its attention to rail expansions, election rumblings, and the gossip of Parliament dinners. The city had resumed its thrum of predictable concerns, oblivious to the fact that it had briefly served as the stage for a performance whose consequences had not quite finished unfolding. One crisp morning in April, Holmes and I stood on the steps of the Royal College of Music, invited by a certain Professor Allardyce, who had recently taken a quiet interest in the unpublished works of émigré composers. An unassuming man in spectacles and a tobacco-stained waistcoat, he greeted us with awkward warmth and escorted us through stone corridors echoing with the faint scales of student rehearsals. "I've reviewed the manuscript Lady Delamere deposited," he told us as we walked. "The one attributed to an anonymous exile. Quite the piece, technically brilliant, melancholic, subversive in tone if not in text. I confess I almost missed the signature embedded in the cello line." Holmes's eyes gleamed. He signed his confession in counterpoint. "Indeed?" the professor said with a smile. "I've taught here for 27 years, never seen anything quite like it. I've arranged for a chamber performance next week. Quietly, we're not advertising it. Just a private evening for staff, scholars, a few students. I trust that's in line with your expectations." "It is," Holmes said simply. We were shown into a modest room where a quartet had been rehearsing. A young violinist, no older than 19, greeted us shyly and asked if we'd care to hear the first movement. Holmes nodded, took a seat, and leaned forward slightly. The performance was raw, not yet polished, but the truth of the music, its tension, its structure, the ache buried in its phrasing, was unmistakable. The fourth note returned, subtly shifted, no longer out of place, but deliberately uneasy, like a question asked in a quiet room. Holmes sat unmoving until the final chord faded. Then he stood, gave the players a small nod of approval, and turned to go. Outside, the wind had picked up. Cherry blossoms from nearby trees floated down through the square like pink snow, catching on Holmes's coat as we walked back toward Baker Street. "You know," I said, "the professor said it's the most remarkable thing he's studied in years. Perhaps that performance will inspire someone. Perhaps the truth will out." Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned his head to watch the petals fall, then said, "There is something paradoxical about the truth, Watson. The more carefully it is hidden, the more it demands to be found. Garadelli's piece was not an explosion. It was a lantern left burning in the dark, waiting for someone to walk by." We crossed into Cavendish Square, where a young boy in knickerbockers was feeding pigeons and an old blind man played a wheezing concertina for coins. Holmes paused beside the musician, listening, then dropped a sovereign into the man's cap. The music faltered in surprise, then grew steadier, fuller, more vibrant. I looked at him askance. "Feeling sentimental?" "Merely repaying a debt," Holmes said quietly. "I once heard a truth I didn't understand. Garadelli offered one with perfect clarity. It is only right to pass the echo on." Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson had laid out tea and scones, but Holmes ignored both, heading directly to his desk. There he pulled from the drawer a narrow wooden box and removed a single page, his own transcription of Garadelli's cipher, not in musical notation this time, but in letters. He had nearly completed the sequence. He turned to me, tapping the final word. "Listen to this," he said. "When decoded, the bars form not a political manifesto, but something far more personal." He read aloud, "If they use my music for darkness, then let it be my final bars that lead them into light." "A poetic encryption," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "A eulogy." Garadelli didn't only fear what his music had been, he hoped for what it might become. There was a long silence, and then, from the street below, came a curious sound. A tune whistled by a boy walking past, high and clear. A melody. Holmes froze. The tune was Garadelli's Adagio, transposed, simplified, but unmistakable. He stepped to the window, looked down. A bootblack no older than 12 was strolling along the curb, dragging his kit behind him, whistling absently. A melody he had heard somewhere, at the concert, from a teacher, from a friend. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice almost inaudible, "do you see? It's already begun." The seed had grown. The melody had escaped the concert hall, the cipher, the fear, and was now walking the streets in the unthinking breath of a boy who'd found it beautiful. "I don't think I've ever seen you quite this moved," I said gently. Holmes closed the window, his expression distant. "I am not moved," he said. "I am reminded." "Of what?" "That sound travels further than words. That even a broken republic can still produce harmony. That truth, once heard, will not be forgotten." He walked to the mantel, picked up his violin, and played the opening bars again, low, reflective, softened by memory. Then he returned it to its case and drew the lid closed. I watched him for a moment longer. "Do you think we'll ever see a case like this again?" I asked. He looked at me, half smiling, half sad. "No," he said. "But I believe in some form we shall hear it." He turned to the fire, then to his chair, and opened the morning paper. And so it was that the case of Anton Garadelli ended not with a trial or an arrest, but with a melody loosed upon the world, unhindered, imperfect, unforgotten, a melody that might yet outlive us all. Some weeks after the quiet recital at the Royal College of Music, a letter arrived at Baker Street bearing an unfamiliar seal, an embossed lyre beneath a crown of laurel. It was an invitation, unsigned but unmistakably official, requesting Holmes and myself to attend a private gathering at a salon in Belgravia hosted by a minor royal patron of the arts. The performance would feature an experimental rendering of early modern compositions, including a selection from an unnamed émigré composer. Holmes smiled faintly at the invitation, then set it aside. "They know," he said, "they know what Garadelli intended, but rather than silence it, they intend to absorb it, defang it through praise, dilute it through recognition." "Isn't that better than suppression?" I asked. He shrugged. "In some ways it is a second death. The meaning fades with every polite applause." And yet he attended. We arrived to find a room full of polite society, ministers, scholars, the occasional peer. Among them was Professor Allardyce, clearly pleased with the attention his reconstruction had received. A young quartet performed a fragment of Garadelli's Adagio for a broken republic, sanded smooth of its discordances. The fourth note had been corrected, the fire had been replaced with formality, and Holmes listened, eyes closed, expression unreadable, until the final bowstroke faded. Later he cornered Allardyce near the drinks table. "You've rewritten it," Holmes said without preamble. "I've clarified it," the professor replied defensively. "The raw version was unsuited to public performance. I've removed the anomalies." Holmes leaned in, quiet but cold. The anomalies were the message. Allardyce said nothing, but Holmes didn't press him further. He simply turned and walked out, leaving his glass untouched. Back in our rooms that evening, Holmes stood at the window, staring into the April dusk. "I suppose that's it, then," I said, settling into my chair. "No," Holmes replied softly. "It isn't." He reached for a sealed envelope and passed it to me. Inside was a letter addressed to the Royal Archives. It was signed not by Holmes, but by a fictitious A.M. Lind, a name he had used before for matters requiring anonymity. The letter enclosed a full transcription of Garadelli's original composition, his decoded cipher, and an explanation of its political context. At the bottom, Holmes had written, "Let this be preserved in full. Let future ears hear what present minds fear. Truth may sleep, but it is never deaf." "You're giving them the truth anyway," I said, smiling. "I am giving it to time," Holmes corrected. "Let them bow to decorum now. History has a longer memory than governments." I folded the letter and handed it back. Holmes placed it in his dispatch box without flourish. There were no more revelations after that, no more letters, no more assassins. Only the slow fading of a case that had burned briefly but brightly, like a flare over still waters. The Circolo Nero faded again into myth. Lady Delamere took up residence in Florence and never returned to London. Armand de Joria published a series of essays on music and morality that never once mentioned Garadelli, and the Adagio, in its many softened forms, began appearing in salons, student recitals, and obscure recordings under vague attributions. But Holmes never played it again. One afternoon in early May, he closed his violin case and said quietly, "The most dangerous truths, Watson, are not the ones shouted in revolution. They are the ones disguised as beauty, because beauty invites us to listen when otherwise we might turn away." I nodded. "And Garadelli?" "He was no hero," Holmes said. "Just a man who once created for the wrong reason, and then, in the final bars of his life, chose to create for the right one." He looked at me, and for once there was no irony in his voice, only solemnity. "He turned a weapon into a witness. That, Watson, is the highest act of courage." And so ended the case of the violinist's last request, not with justice served in court or villains unmasked before a crowd, but with a melody that had travelled through silence, pain and shadow to reach the one place it could not be destroyed: memory. Not Holmes's most famous case, but in my estimation his most human,